you know nothing about the soldiers of ancient Rome. When most of us imagine a Roman legionnaire, we picture an image from Hollywood movies. Perfectly fitted armor glistening in the sun, identical scarlet cloaks, and orderly rows of soldiers who look like clones. But what if I told you that this image is just a beautiful illusion that has little to do with reality? The real clothing of a Roman soldier is not a story about dress uniforms, but about survival in harsh conditions. Music, it is a story of a constant struggle with the weather, marches of many kilometers, and endless repairs to equipment. Music, behind the glamour of eagles and standards lay a cruel truth that is not usually talked about in movies. Watch the video to the end to find out what a legionnaire actually looked like and felt when dressed in his gear, and why his clothing was both his best friend and his worst enemy. What if I told you that everything you believed about the appearance of a Roman legionnaire was untrue? The idea of a single standard uniform for the entire Roman army is a modern misconception. In reality, the legion was a rather colorful sight where one soldier's equipment could differ significantly from that of his neighbor in formation. The state provided recruits with a basic set of equipment, but the cost of this set was deducted from their pay. This meant that soldiers were in debt from the very beginning of their service. Every lost or broken piece of equipment became their personal financial problem. That is why legionnaires were forced to constantly repair and patch their clothes and armor. Old tunics were mended countless times and patches were applied to leather armor straps. It was an army where thrift and repair skills were valued no less than the ability to wield a sword. Over time, soldiers were able to improve their equipment at their own expense. A wealthier legionnaire could afford to buy a better quality helmet or a more comfortable tunic. This led to even greater diversity in the appearance of soldiers from the same unit. Equipment also depended heavily on where the legion was stationed. Soldiers stationed on the border in cold Britain wore things that their colleagues in hot Egypt would never need. The army was forced to adapt, and this adaptation was reflected in their clothing. The production of armor and clothing was not concentrated in one place. Each province had its own workshops which could produce equipment with slight differences in design. A helmet made in Gaul might differ slightly from a helmet forged on the Danube. Even the color of clothing was not strictly regulated. Although the color red is often associated with the Roman army, most soldiers most likely wore tunics made of undyed wool in natural shades, beige, gray, or brown. Bright dyes were expensive and were reserved for officers and ceremonial occasions. The army was a living organism and its appearance was constantly changing. Equipment wore out, was replaced with captured items or repaired with whatever was at hand. A legionnaire on the march looked not like a model from an exhibition, but like a hardy worker whose clothing was his main tool. Thus, the Roman army was united in its discipline and fighting spirit, but not in its clothing. It was an army of practitioners where functionality always took precedence over ceremonial uniformity. It was this flexibility that made it so effective. We would love to hear your opinion. What do you think about a system where soldiers were responsible for their own equipment and its repair? Write about it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new episodes. Are you ready to learn the shocking truth about the most basic, but also the most vital item of clothing for a Roman legionnaire? Forget about impressive armor and helmets with plumes. The real functional basis of every soldier's wardrobe was a modest tunic. Tuna. It was a simple-looking but incredibly functional and well-designed piece of clothing that legionnaires wore next to their skin, practically never taking it off day or night, 24/7. The tunic was not just clothing, but a second layer of skin without which existence in the army was impossible. It was the foundation on which the rest of the legionnaire's costume was built, from underwear to armor. The main and only material available for mass production of tunics was sheep's wool of varying quality depending on rank. This traditional choice was not accidental or dictated by tradition. Wool has unique thermodynamic properties that are unattainable for other natural fabrics. It effectively warms the body even when soaked through in the rain, actively wicks sweat and moisture away from the skin to the outside, evaporating them, and is a very durable material that can last for years. Wool was ideal for soldiers, unrivaled in practicality, proven by thousands of years of use from Greece to Rome. The design of the tunic was ingenious precisely in its primitive simplicity of cut. It consisted of just two rectangular pieces of coarse fabric of the same size sewn together with a simple seam at the shoulders and sides vertically with deliberately left openings for the head at the top and arms at the sides. Such basic clothing without a complex cut did not restrict the movement of the arms and legs at all, which was critically important in hand-to-hand combat with a sword and shield. The simplicity of the cut also meant that it was cheap to mass-produce and easy to repair. Any soldier could sew up a hole or replace a piece of fabric in the field without a tailor. Contrary to popular belief in movies, not all legionnaires' tunics were bright red or scarlet. The vast majority of ordinary legionnaires actually wore tunics made of unbleached wool in natural colors from cream and gray to dark brown and black depending on the breed of sheep. Red pigment from plants or mollusks was economically expensive to produce and was used selectively mainly for the ceremonial tunics of commanders and in elite guard units the praetorians for uniformity and to intimidate the enemy. Red was a privilege, not the norm. Ordinary legionaries wore gray or brown, blending in with the dust of the roads rather than standing out as a red spot for enemy archers. The length of the tunic and the presence of sleeves could also vary significantly depending on the climate of the province of service. Usually the standard tunic reached the knees or slightly above, which provided maximum freedom of movement for the legs when marching and running. In the colder northern provinces, Britain, Germany, Pannonia, soldiers were allowed by their commanders to wear tunics with long sleeves, reaching to the wrist for extra warmth and protection from the cold. Adaptation to the climate was permitted. A frozen soldier is useless, so pragmatism prevailed over uniformity of form. The main thing was to maintain the legion's combat readiness in all conditions. The tunic was belted at the waist with a special wide soldier's leather belt, a cingulum with metal plaques. The belt not only practically supported loose clothing, preventing it from dangling, but also served to carry a gladius sword on the right side and a puyo dagger on the left on hooks. It was also an important visible symbol of a soldier's status and military affiliation. Civilians did not wear military belts. It was a privilege and a sign of a legionnaire. And to unbuckle it meant to retire or be stripped of rank, to lose honor along with the belt. Under heavy metal armor, the lora segmentatida or hamada. The tunic performed another critically important protective function for the body. It served as a soft cushioning layer, reliably protecting delicate skin from constant rubbing against hard metal and stiff leather parts of the armor during movement. Without such a fabric lining between the body and the metal, wearing heavy armor weighing 15-20 kilo-hours for long periods of time would have been a real torture, resulting in bloody abrasions and infections. The tunic was not just clothing but a medical necessity, a barrier between the skin and metal, preventing wounds from one's own armor, which sounds paradoxical, but was a reality for heavy infantry. Legionnaires were required to have at least 2 tunics in their personal belongings. One for dirty everyday wear, work and combat, and another cleaner and intact for official occasions, parades and inspections. Clean clothing was strictly important for maintaining military discipline, appearance and the health of soldiers. A dirty, sweaty tunic that had not been washed for weeks could easily become a breeding ground for skin diseases, rashes, fungi and lice. An epidemic capable of putting entire cohorts out of action without a fight, which was unacceptable to the command, which strictly monitored hygiene. Washing tunics was a regular weekly duty for each soldier personally. Legionnaires washed their dirty tunics in nearby rivers or streams, vigorously, using caustic lye from ash or special absorbent types of clay, fuller's earth, as a primitive detergent to remove grease and dirt. The washed clothes were then dried in the bright sun for disinfection, spread out on hot stones or hung on bushes in the camp. Washing was not a luxury but a matter of survival. A clean tunic meant healthy skin and therefore a combat-ready soldier ready to march and fight without being distracted by itching and pain from rashes. For a legionnaire, a tunic was literally everything in one item. Work clothes for building the camp, underwear under a rower, and even pajamas for sleeping in a tent at night. It was his second skin, and his personal comfort and combat readiness directly depended on its physical condition, cleanliness, integrity, and dryness. It was precisely in the apparent simplicity of the cut and the versatility of this modest item of clothing that its true genius lay. One item for all needs. Minimalism of functionality perfected by Roman pragmatism. But what exactly did legionnaires wear under their tunics on their bare bodies for hygiene? Did they have something similar to modern underwear? The answer, which I will reveal in the next intriguing chapter, may exceed all your expectations about Roman intimate hygiene and surprise modern people. I will reveal the most intimate and closely guarded secret of the Roman military wardrobe which is not discussed in museums. It is difficult for modern people accustomed to underwear to even imagine. But Roman legionnaires did not have underwear in our usual understanding of the term at all. The concepts of underpants or long johns were completely foreign to their culture and were associated exclusively with barbarian peoples. The Gauls, Germans and Scythians as a symbol of savagery and backwardness. For a Roman, wearing pants was as shameful as it would be for a modern man to wear a woman's dress. It was humiliating, indecent, and unthinkable for a wearer of the toga, a citizen of the world's greatest civilization. The only basis of a legionnaire's underwear was the so-called subligastulum in Latin. In essence, it was a simple loin cloth or a rectangular piece of linen fabric the size of a towel wrapped around the hips and between the legs like a diaper or Japanese fundy. This minimalist garment had been known to the Romans since the time of the mysterious Etruscans in the 8th century BC and was traditionally considered an attribute of athletes in stadiums, gladiators in arenas, and slaves performing heavy physical labor under the scorching sun. It was functional clothing, not a status symbol. The less on the body, the more practical it was for working in the heat, where every extra layer of fabric was a source of overheating and discomfort. It is critical to understand that the subliger was not a mandatory part of standard soldier equipment according to the regulations. Many legionnaires, especially those serving in the hot Mediterranean climate of Africa, Syria, and Egypt, deliberately preferred not to wear anything at all under their tunics on their bare bodies. This ensured the best possible natural ventilation of the groin and prevented painful skin chafing during endless long marches of 25 kilometers a day. Freedom of movement and air circulation were more important than false modesty. Skin rubbed raw between the legs rendered a soldier incapacitated faster than an enemy sword. So many chose complete nudity under their tunics as the lesser of two evils. The subligaculum was usually made of affordable linen or thin soft wool depending on wealth. Linen was preferred for intimate areas as it absorbed profuse sweat much better and was more pleasant to the sensitive skin of the perineum. However, linen fabric was significantly less durable and wear-resistant than wool and wore out and tore more quickly from friction and washing, requiring frequent replacement. The choice of material was a compromise between comfort and durability. Linen was a luxury. Wool was practical for a poor soldier who needed clothing that would last for months without replacement. The main practical function of the loin cloth was basic hygiene in the absence of a shower. It effectively absorbed sweat from the groin and protected the expensive tunic from direct contamination by the body and secretions. Washing a small piece of fabric the size of a handkerchief was much easier and faster than washing an entire massive tunic, saving water, time, and effort. The subliger was a consumable item that was changed and washed daily. While the tunic could be worn for weeks without washing, remaining relatively clean thanks to the protective barrier of the bandage between the body and the fabric. Wearing a subliger was also a matter of practicality during heavy physical work involving lifting. It provided some mechanical support and compression to the groin area, similar to a modern sports bandage or jock strap, preventing injury. This was especially important when legionnaires performed strenuous engineering work such as building camps, digging deep trenches, and lifting heavy weights. Any activity involving strain required support to prevent inguinal hernias and strains that could sideline a soldier for weeks without the possibility of treatment. Roman society as a whole had a much more relaxed and natural attitude towards nudity than our Christianized Puritan society. Public baths were an absolute norm of everyday life for all classes, and the sight of a completely naked body did not cause moral shock or condemnation. It was a norm of hygiene. Therefore, the complete absence of underwear under a tunic was categorically not considered indecent, shameful, or immoral. It was natural, close to nature, and not a perversion. The shame of nudity was an invention of Christianity. Pagan Rome did not know this complex. The body was a tool, not a source of sin. So there was no need to hide it from oneself or others. Interestingly, the Latin word subligastulum etymologically comes from the roots subligo to tie from below and liare to bind to tie with a knot. This descriptive name accurately and literally describes how this minimalist garment was worn. It was literally tied with a rope or knotted around the body at the waist and between the legs, held in place by ties rather than elastic. A technology unavailable to the ancients, which made wearing the loin cloth an art that required practice so that it would not come undone and fall off at the most inopportune moment during a march or battle. The very idea of wearing long pants or any kind of closed underwear seemed ridiculous, absurd, and effeminate to the cultured Romans, a sign of weakness. They sincerely believed it to be a clear sign of the pampered nature of barbarians, unable to tolerate the cold, and of barbarism, backwardness from civilization. A true valiant Roman and legionnaire had to stoically endure any weather conditions, heat, cold, rain, in a single tunic without complaint, demonstrating the superiority of the spirit over the body. Trousers were a capitulation to the climate, an admission of the weakness of the flesh, unworthy of a citizen of Rome, who with his will and discipline conquered not only enemies but also nature itself without resorting to barbaric tricks such as trousers to protect against the cold. Thus, the intimate world beneath a legionnaire's tunic was one of extreme Spartan minimalism without excess. Practicality in battle and basic hygiene were the top priorities, and modern ideas about comfort, propriety and underwear had no significance or weight in decisions. This was another striking detail that clearly emphasized the harsh and utilitarian life of the Roman army where everything was subordinated to a single goal. The effectiveness of the soldier as a fighting machine rather than his personal comfort or conformity to the norms of decency of civilian society which were a luxury of peacetime. What I am about to show you is an ingenious engineering solution that trod the earth from Britain to Persia. I am talking about caligae, the famous Roman military sandals. This footwear was not just part of the uniform but a high-tech tool designed for marches of many kilometers. Caligae consisted of three main parts: a thick multi-layered sole, an upper made of a single piece of leather and straps. The sole was made of several layers of cowhide glued and stitched together. It could be up to a centimeter thick or more, providing excellent protection for the foot. The main feature of caligae was the heavy iron nails with large heads that reinforced the sole. Each sandal had between 80 and 100 such nails. They served several functions at once. They protected the sole from wear and tear, provided excellent traction, and turned the caliga into a formidable weapon in close combat. The upper part was cut from a single piece of durable leather. It had a complex system of slits that allowed it to fit snugly around the foot while leaving it open. This openwork design provided excellent ventilation. This air conditioning system was vital. It prevented the development of diaper rash and fungal diseases that could incapacitate entire units. Soldiers' feet remained dry even in hot climates. However, this ingenious design had its drawbacks. In cold and damp climates such as Britain or Germany, open shoes became a problem. Soldiers were forced to wear woolen socks, which was unusual for the Romans but necessary. In addition, the nails on the soles made the caligae very slippery on smooth stone surfaces. Walking in them on the cobbled streets of cities was a real challenge. They were also completely unsuitable for snow and ice. Repairing caligae was a constant concern for legionaries. Nails fell out, straps broke, and soles wore out. Every soldier carried spare nails and tools to repair his shoes because his mobility depended on their condition. The service life of a single pair of caligae when used intensively did not exceed a few months. It has been estimated that during his service a legionnaire could wear out dozens of pairs of shoes. This made shoemaking one of the most important crafts in any military camp. Despite its shortcomings, the kiga was the ideal footwear for the tactics employed by the Roman army. It was designed for long and fast marches across rough terrain. It was in these sandals that the Roman legions marched and conquered most of the known world. In the next chapter, you will learn how much the armor that a legionnaire wore every day weighed. Armor or lara was the most expensive and important piece of a legionnaire's protective equipment. It was his shield against enemy swords and spears, but at the same time a heavy burden that he was forced to carry constantly. There were several basic types of armor, each with its own advantages and disadvantages. The oldest and most common type was lora hamada or chain mail. It consisted of thousands of small iron rings connected to each other. This type of armor was flexible, did not restrict movement, and provided good protection against cutting blows. The main disadvantage of chain mail was its weight, which could reach 10 to 15 kilograms. The weight was distributed mainly on the shoulders, which caused severe fatigue when worn for long periods of time. In addition, it was vulnerable to piercing blows which could push the rings apart. The most famous type of Roman armor is the lora segmentata. This armor consisted of horizontal metal plates connected by leather straps and buckles. It provided excellent protection against most types of weapons. Lurca segmentata weighed less than chain mail, about 9 kilograms, and distributed weight better across the body. However, its construction was very complex. The many leather straps required constant maintenance. They got wet in the rain and broke at the most inopportune moments. Repairing segmentata in the field was a real problem. Repairing a torn strap or replacing a broken buckle was much more difficult than inserting a new ring into chain mail. Therefore, many legions, especially in remote provinces, preferred the old and reliable ham. There was also a third type of armor, lora squamata or scale armor. It consisted of many small metal plates sewn onto a fabric or leather base. This type of armor was popular with standard bears and musicians as it looked very impressive. Regardless of the type, all armor required careful maintenance. After each battle or campaign, it had to be cleaned of dirt and rust. Soldiers used sand and oil to keep their armor in working order. Wearing armor in hot climates was a real challenge. The metal heated up in the sun, and the lack of ventilation led to overheating. The tunic under the armor would become soaked with sweat in a matter of minutes. Thus, the lara was a double-edged sword. It saved lives in battle, but in everyday life, it was a source of constant discomfort and hard work. It was literally the weight of glory that every legionnaire carried on his shoulders. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what protected a Roman soldier's head? The helmet or gala was not just a piece of metal, but a complex piece of engineering, the design of which was constantly improved based on bloody combat experience. Its shape changed to reflect the new threats facing the empire. Early Roman helmets such as the Monteferino type were simple and functional. They were hemispherical in shape with a small neck guard and massive cheek guards. Their main purpose was to protect against blows from above. However, as the empire expanded, the Romans encountered new enemies. The Gauls, for example, delivered powerful downward blows. In response, Roman armorers created the so-called imperial Glick helmets with reinforced top protection and a wide neck guard. The most serious challenge came during the Dian Wars. The Dian used huge two-handed sickle-shaped swords called falces, which could cut through any helmet. This threat forced the Romans to take an unprecedented step. They began to install cross-shaped reinforcing plates on their helmets. The helmet's cheek guards also evolved. They became larger, covering almost the entire face, but leaving a good field of vision. They protected not only from direct blows, but also from glancing blows that could strike the face or jaw. For additional cushioning, the helmet had a wool or leather lining inside. It not only softened blows, but also ensured a comfortable fit on the head. Without such a lining, wearing a metal helmet would have been unbearable. Many helmets had special holders for a crest made of horsehair or feathers. Contrary to what is shown in films, ordinary legionaries did not wear crests in battle as they were cumbersome and gave away their position. Crests were an attribute of parade uniforms and officers, and centurions wore them across their helmets. The helmet was not only protection, but also an important psychological weapon. The metal glinting in the sun, the covered face, and the menacing appearance made a frightening impression on the enemy. It turned the soldier into a faceless part of a fighting machine. Like armor, helmets required maintenance. They had to be cleaned and polished to prevent rust. Soldiers often decorated their helmets with engravings or embossing, making them a source of personal pride. Thus, the Roman helmet was the result of centuries of evolution. Every detail, every curve was dictated by the harsh necessity of survival on the battlefield. It was a fusion of engineering, combat experience, and soldierly pride. In the next chapter, we will learn how the Romans solved the problem of cold weather, which will completely destroy a popular myth. There is a persistent myth that the Romans, accustomed to the warm Mediterranean climate of Italy, treated the barbaric clothing of the northerners with arrogant contempt and froze in the northern provinces out of pride. However, this is completely inconsistent with historical reality and archaeological findings. The Roman army was an extremely pragmatic organization focused on survival and quickly adopted from its enemies and conquered peoples absolutely everything that was practically useful for the survival and combat effectiveness of the legions. Pride gave way to necessity. A frozen soldier cannot fight and a dead soldier cannot conquer. So adaptation was not a choice but an imperative for the army's survival on the hostile borders of the empire. The main salvation of the legionnaires from the northern cold and inclement weather was a warm cloak. An indispensable piece of equipment. There were two main types of military cloaks: the sagum and the panula, which differed in design. The sagum was a simple rectangular piece of thick, dense woolen fabric measuring about 2x1 meter, which was draped over the shoulder and fastened on the right shoulder with a decorative fibula, a metal brooch clasp, leaving the right hand free to wield a sword. The sagum was a traditional military cloak, a symbol of a soldier in contrast to the civilian toga. Wearing a sagum in Rome meant declaring war or martial law. It was a sign of militarism. The panula was a more sophisticated and practical design for protection from the elements. It was an oval or semicircular cloak made of waterproof wool with a central opening for the head and a sewn-on hood similar to a modern South American poncho. It completely covered the body and arms up to the wrists, providing excellent protection from heavy rain, piercing wind, and snow at the same time. The panula was a versatile all-weather piece of equipment, clothing, tent, and blanket in one, which made it invaluable for soldiers on campaign where every gram of weight counts and multifunctionality is critical. The most revolutionary discovery for the conservative Romans who encountered the harsh winters of Gaul and Germany for the first time was pants, or bray in Latin. Initially, traditional Romans categorically considered pants to be barbaric, ridiculous, and even effeminate clothing of barbarians, unworthy of a civilized person. However, the harsh practicality of the cold took unconditional precedence over cultural prejudices and pride. Survival was more important than saving face in front of the barbarians, who wore what the Romans had ridiculed for centuries as a sign of backwardness. Legionnaires in the northern border garrisons, Britain, Germany, began to wear tight-fitting woolen trousers of the Celtic type, reaching to the knees or ankles under the tunic. This revolutionary innovation was so critical to maintaining the health and combat effectiveness of the army in the cold that it was eventually officially approved and legalized by the High Command and even the emperors despite protests from conservative senators in Rome. This is a striking historical example of Roman pragmatism triumphing over dogma. The survival of the army is more important than tradition. Effectiveness is more important than principles. Results are more important than form, which is what made Rome great. The ability to learn from enemies without false pride. For additional warmth for the feet and protection for the shins, wrappings were used. Phasi corrales. These were long strips of woolen fabric about the width of a palm which were methodically wound over the trousers from the ankle to the knee in a crisscross pattern like bandages. They effectively protected against the piercing cold of snow, the dampness of swamps and minor injuries such as scratches from bushes, insect bites and blows from stones while marching. The wrappings were cheap, versatile and could serve as bandages in case of injury. Multifunctionality in the spirit of Roman efficiency in the use of resources. Another important element of a legionnaire's winter clothing was the focal, a woolen scarf or neckerchief. It was wrapped tightly around the vulnerable neck in several layers for warmth. Not only did it effectively protect the neck from the wind, but it also critically protected the skin of the neck from painful chafing by heavy metal armor and the edge of the helmet during prolonged wear. Without a focal, the skin on the neck would quickly rub raw from the friction of metal against sweaty skin during movement, making wearing armor unbearable. The scarf was a medical necessity, not a fashion accessory for warmth. In particularly cold weather below zero, soldiers could practically wear several layers of clothing at once, like an onion. For example, under the main thick woolen tunic, another additional thin linen tunic was worn as thermal underwear. This created an insulating air layer between the layers of fabric which perfectly retained body heat, preventing it from escaping. Layering was the ancient equivalent of the modern system of layered clothing worn by tourists. Each layer added warmth, but the overall weight and thickness increased more slowly than with a single thick layer of the same warmth. Leather and fur elements were also widely used by legionnaires for additional body warmth. Soldiers in cold garrisons could wear vests or sleeveless jackets made of sheepskin with the fur inside directly under their metal armor for warmth and cushioning. Leather or fur mittens, although not widely used in the ranks due to the inconvenience of holding weapons, were also used during static guard duty on the ramparts in severe frosts when unprotected hands would freeze in minutes, rendering the soldier incapable of fighting. Frostbite was a real threat that maiming legionnaires without a single enemy. Thus, the Roman army not only did not freeze helplessly in the north, but also methodically created a very effective and well-thought-out multi-layered system of winter clothing over centuries of service. It successfully adapted to the harsh conditions of the northern borders of the empire, adopting the best from the Celts, Germans, and Yen. The popular myth of proud legionnaires freezing in open sandals in the snow, refusing to wear pants on principle, has no historical or archaeological basis. It is a romantic fiction that does not stand up to the test of reality, archaeological findings, and common-sense survival instincts. Legionnaire's equipment was not limited to what he carried on his person. He carried the heaviest part of his load on his back on a special T-shaped pole called a pillow moralis. This entire camping kit together with the pole was called a cirsa. The total weight of the sarcina could reach 20-30 kilograms. With this load, as well as in full armor and with weapons, a legionnaire had to walk up to 30 kilometers a day. This required incredible physical endurance. The cursina included a mesh bag with personal belongings. It contained spare clothing, hygiene items such as a scraper stridulus, and small personal valuables. Each soldier had his own small treasure. A bronze cooking pot was a mandatory part of the load. Soldiers also carried provisions for several days. This was usually grain, which they had to grind themselves with a hand mill, and bacon to flatbread. The most important part of the load was tools. Each legionnaire carried a pickaxe, delabra, a basket for earthworks, a saw, or an axe. The army was not only a fighting force, but also a huge construction organization. It was with these tools that the soldiers built a fortified camp every evening after a tiring march. They dug a moat and built a rampart for the palisade on the rampart. Each carried 2 pointed wooden stakes. A leather water bag was also attached to the sarcina. In hot climates or aid areas, having a sufficient supply of water was a matter of life and death. Losing a water bag was worse than losing part of one's equipment. This entire structure was hoisted onto the shoulder and required skill to carry. The pole allowed the load to be quickly dropped in case of a sudden attack. Soldiers were trained to do this in a matter of seconds. Constantly carrying such weight led to occupational diseases. The backs and joints of the legionaries were subjected to enormous strain. It was a heavy price to pay for the mobility and autonomy of the Roman army. The Czarzyna was the legionnaires' real mobile home. It contained everything necessary for life, combat, and work. It was this system that allowed the Roman legions to operate away from their supply bases and maintain the highest combat readiness anywhere in the world. The harsh truth about Roman soldiers' equipment is that it was constantly breaking. Combat, weather conditions, and marches of many kilometers led to the wear and tear of everything from sandals to armor. Therefore, legionnaires spent a significant part of their time not on military training, but on endless repairs. Leather elements were the most vulnerable. The straps holding the plates of the lara segmentata rubbed and tore. The straps of sandals and helmets broke at the most inopportune moments. Every soldier was required to know how to work with leather. He carried in all needles and spare strips of leather with him. Repairing straps was a routine evening task in the camp. The metal parts of the equipment required no less attention. Rust was the main enemy. After every rain or river crossing, the armor and helmet had to be thoroughly dried, cleaned with sand and lubricated with oil. The plates of the lara segmentata could bend from strong blows. Soldiers straightened them with a hammer on a makeshift anvil. Replacing damaged plates was a more difficult task that required the help of the camp blacksmith. Clothing also needed constant repair. Woolen tunics and cloaks wore out and tore. The ability to sew and patch was a vital skill. Even weapons required constant care. Swords, gladius, and daggers puio had to be sharpened regularly. Spear shafts pilum could crack and had to be replaced. Each legion had skilled craftsmen, immunes who were exempt from some of their daily duties. They were blacksmiths, armorers, shoemakers, and carpenters. However, their services cost money, so ordinary soldiers tried to do most of the work themselves. This constant labor was an invisible war that soldiers fought every day. Not only their own lives, but also the combat effectiveness of the entire unit depended directly on their ability to keep their equipment in working order. Faulty armor or torn calage could have fatal consequences. Thus, the life of a legionnaire was that of a skilled worker. He was a shoemaker, a cobbler, and a locksmith. This harsh necessity turned recruits into jack-of-all-trades, capable of surviving in the most difficult conditions. The appearance of a Roman soldier not only protected him but also spoke of his status and merits. Various elements of clothing and equipment served as signs of distinction, allowing one to determine at a glance the rank and role of a soldier in the complex military hierarchy. It was a whole system of visual codes. The most noticeable difference between officers, especially centurions, was the crest on their helmets. Unlike the longitudinal crest of the legates, the centurion's crest was transverse. This made him easily visible in battle and allowed soldiers to easily find their commander. Centurions also wore greaves to protect their shins, which was a privilege not available to ordinary legionaries. Their tunics and cloaks were often brighter in color, such as true red or white. The centurion held a vine vitus in his hands, a symbol of his authority and right to punish his subordinates. Standard bearers signify equilipari also stood out for their appearance. They wore the skins of wild animals such as bears or wolves over their helmets. This was not only a tribute to ancient traditions but also a way to make them more visible and impressive. Ordinary soldiers who showed bravery in battle received special awards. Faller. These were large silver or gilded discs with images of gods or the emperor. Faller were attached to a special leather harness which was worn over armor on ceremonial occasions. In addition to faii, soldiers could receive other awards. These were armil bracelets and torquus necklaces, which were originally trophies taken from defeated Celtic warriors. Receiving such an award was a great honor. Even a belt cingulum could indicate status. Officers' belts were wider and more richly decorated with silver fittings. The number and length of leather straps on the apron could also be significant. The soldiers of the Taurian Guard, the emperor's personal bodyguards, had the most luxurious equipment. Their armor and helmets were decorated with embossing and enamel. They wore tunics and cloaks of special colors emphasizing their elite status. Musicians such as trumpeters, tubicentes, and buglers, cornettis also had distinctive elements in their clothing. Their equipment was often more richly decorated. They played a key role in commanding troops on the battlefield, transmitting signals from commanders. Thus, clothing and equipment in the Roman army were not merely functional items. They were the language spoken by the military hierarchy. A legionnaire's appearance revealed his entire career, his rank, his exploits, and his place in Rome's indestructible military machine. We have come a long way. From a simple woolen tunic to the richly decorated armor of a Taurian, we have seen that the real clothing of a Roman legionnaire had little in common with the glamorous images from the movies. It was a world of practicality, endless repairs, and ingenious engineering solutions dictated by harsh necessity. A soldier's clothing was his fortress and his burden. It protected him from enemy weapons in the elements, but required constant care and weighed dozens of kilograms. The history of Roman military costume is the story of how the empire created the most enduring, versatile, and effective soldier of its time. Please suggest topics for future videos that you would like to see on our channel in the comments. Which era or aspect of military history interests you the most? And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss our new explorations of the past.